Hi, I'm Mike Martin, a certified business and executive coach, and I put together this video training as part of my series, Entrepreneurial Growth for Nonprofit Organizations. And today's training is focused on succession planning made simple. Now, before we dive into this too much, I just wanted to share my information. In case you want to find out more information, you can reach me at that website there, michaelmartin.focalpointcoaching.com. You can email me at mmartin@focalpointcoaching or even call me at the number on the screen there. So I just wanted to get that out of the way up front. I will revisit this at the end and put that up at the end of the training. But diving right into it, succession planning really is a critical aspect that we should do that we often don't do in our organizations. And today I wanted to go through what I see as some of the challenges and opportunities that are present in succession planning, why we don't do it, and what we can do about it. I'll cover 3 keys for successful planning. I'll talk a bit about the process and we'll do a deeper dive on a toolkit that I've developed that will be shared with you as well. You can download that. It's all in an Excel file, and we'll go through that in detail. And then we'll just talk about some takeaway items and action items that you can do. And a lot of that will be related to the workbook and toolkit. So I recommend pause the video now, make sure you have that workbook downloaded and you have it available. I'll also make a link available to that under the my website as well under some resources. So in all my interactions, especially when I'm working with clients or doing trainings like this, I strive to give as much value as possible and really maximize the content so that your time is very efficient and effectively used. And when I work with my coaching clients, the more you put into this, the more value you will get out. So I know this is a video training, but I hope that you will stick with me throughout it. I will try and go quickly and just stick to value and not put a lot of fluff in here. So what we want to do is identify challenges, opportunities, and really 3 must do essential keys to enable us to implement succession planning. By the end, I hope I've given you tools that you can take action on your succession planning and get started, but more on that in a bit. Let's start out by talking about some of the challenges we face when we're trying to plan for succession in our organizations. Number one, we often do not prioritize this as something that we feel is very urgent or that we do. And therefore, it often gets put on the back burner. We're so focused on the mission at hand that we really don't often take the time to focus on what happens when we need to do succession. And by that, I mean who takes over for any role in the organization, especially leadership roles. So, because of this, the fact that we don't prioritize it and we're constantly, just kind of focused on what's ahead of us, we're very busy, right? And so we haven't really defined perhaps all of the roles and responsibilities in our organization. And again, depending on a role, we might have, if we're in a leader position or the CEO or managing director, we might have a good sense of these roles, but are they really clear throughout the organization? And so we want to make sure that we document roles and responsibilities and make them clear. But sometimes there's ambiguity there, and it can be tough. The other thing is maybe we don't know where to start with succession planning or even how to do it. Um, you know, and this is what I hope to achieve through this training is that I'll give you a very good starting point and a bit of a plan that you can follow to get started. The other thing is we run the risk that there may be a leadership gap in our organization. And if we don't do succession planning, we have an extremely high risk that we might not be prepared for someone's departure, especially in a leadership role, which can be very significant to the organization. Also, on down the organization. So, depending on it, we also have a risk for organizational disruption here. And really, in the worst case, this could be a complete collapse of the organization. especially more likely in smaller organizations. So we really want to make sure that we avoid this and do what we can to reduce this risk of a organizational disruption or worse. So the good news that is that this all presents us with a really good opportunity. Number one, we can raise awareness about the need to do succession planning. And when we're strategic in this, we actually create power because we can focus our resource and our efforts for greater results here to the strategic direction. So we raise awareness in the organization to start to think about doing succession planning and allocating resources to this important task. We need to seek out some information and make sure that we start to prioritize this, and such as this session. And I hope this session will help do that. The other thing is getting really clear and building the right culture. So 80% of success is attributed to being really clear on what we're trying to achieve. So if we understand some of those challenges, this risk that we have of organizational disruption or leadership gap, we need to get clear on what should happen in our organization if someone decides to move on. What do we want things to look like, really look like, if and when that happens? And then we want to enhance our knowledge about how to do succession planning. And like the graphic here, 1, 2, 3, let's go. Let's implement, right? Let's get the knowledge. It doesn't have to be perfect, but let's get enough information that we can get started on the succession planning and adjust as we go. But the most important is those first steps. And therefore, rather than those risks, we can actually ensure sustainability of the mission and our impact. When we get this right, succession planning, we can ensure that we don't have that gap or that worst scenario where we get some significant disruption. And we can make sure we stay on track and we have a very smooth transition when someone wants to leave the organization. So I always like to have a big idea in my talks. And so let's talk about the big idea here. Really, it's the things that you must get right. And that's what I'm going to talk about next with these 3 keys. I'll share 3 keys that you must absolutely get right in order to have a good succession plan. And again, what we want to do is eliminate that risk and actually become proactive so that we can ensure smooth sustainability of the mission in these transition periods. And this quote right here, I include in almost all of my content because I just love it, from General Patton here. A good plan violently executed right now is better than a perfect plan next week. And what this means here is now is better than perfection. And I'm very much a proponent of just getting started. So the plan is important and getting it right is certainly important, but action is the most important thing. Nothing happens if you don't start to execute. You could have the world's best ideas or even have a plan, but if it's locked away and no one knows about it, it's not going to have any impact on you. So I urge you to take the information that I'm sharing here today and just get started, and don't wait until you get the plan perfect. Just get started, and I hope that what I'm sharing here will give you a very good jump start. So I do often go much deeper when I work in my one-on-one sessions with my clients or in group coaching. But in order to keep this video manageable here, I've kind of distilled this down into the 3 most essential keys that you must get right in order to have a succession plan here. And again, I'm more than happy to talk with anybody viewing this video. If you're interested in going a little bit deeper, again, the contact information is here. I'm happy to have more discussion, but I hope that I can provide a bunch of value. So the number 1 first key is to create a culture of transparency and adaptability. And what I mean here is we want to emphasize open communication. And also, it's important to understand the communication styles and behavior of your team. This is work I often do with my clients where we use tools like perhaps a DISC assessment or other assessment tools, which will tell us how people like to communicate. And so Communication is a first key step in creating that culture of openness. And that allows our team to be ready to deal with change when it comes, specifically in this case, dealing with succession planning. And so we foster this adaptability to change. So things like lessons from, if you're familiar with the book, Who Moved My Cheese? It's a great read if you haven't read it already. But we want to understand and be prepared for change, which in succession planning is very critical because we're dealing with what may be a very significant change here, the departure of a director or a leader. And so there's something called Gleicher's formula, which is C equals D times V times Fs, which is greater than R. So to break that down, change is the C equals D, which is the dissatisfaction in the organization, times V, which is our vision of the future, times first steps, the FS. All of those need to be greater than our resistance to change. Now, if there's a departure of a leader, and in some cases those might be emergency departures where we didn't plan for it, the change is thrust upon us. But either way, even if we're planning for succession and we know someone's going to leave, change is upon us. And so we need to understand that formula and use it. Make sure that we understand, make the first steps in our succession plan easy and digestible, and then make sure that we create that vision of the future for what it will look like after the new person is in the role. So creating a culture based on open, transparent communication and adaptability is very important to facilitate these smoother leadership transitions and a more inclusive planning process, right? We want to make sure that our organization is including all of the stakeholders in the process, as well as in our communication about the changes to the entire organization. So the next key is doing robust knowledge transfer. And so again, we talked about knowing roles and responsibilities, and this will come into play later when we get into the toolkit. But we want to make sure that we build structured knowledge transfer programs, such as a mentorship, documentation, knowledge sharing, documentation of standard operating procedures, training materials, because all of this will support our succession plan. We must ensure that critical relationships in our organization and knowledge transfer is happening from leadership to successors. So when we have someone move on, we need the leader to transfer what they know and the relationships they have to their replacement. And so we need to create a culture in our organization where we know all the important things about that organization. We know our values, our vision, our mission statement, what we're doing, our standard operating procedures, who we, what are the critical relationships our organization has? How do we manage the day to day? Having all of that documented is going to be an absolute pillar for doing succession planning, because without it, we don't know what's going on, right? And so, as discussed in his book, The E-Myth Revisited, Michael Gerber talks about creating a franchise model where anyone can run the business. So if you're the leader or executive director, you need to be thinking about what happens when I'm not in this position anymore. If I move on, can this organization function without me? And as a matter of fact, to be an effective leader, even when you're in the role, you need to make sure that the organization can run without you so you can focus on the key things that only you can do while the organization can move forward and manage the day to day. You, as the executive director or CEO or leader, need to be able to think about the future and what direction we're going and what's coming down the road for our organization while the day to day can manage. And that's really the only way to have a very high functioning operational organization. It's critical in succession planning because having that in place means that we can move the leader on and the organization is ready to stand on its own. So we need to emphasize the value of preserving this institutional knowledge and maintaining that organizational continuity. So it's really critical that we put knowledge transfer structures in place and making sure that leadership and staff document all their critical job functions, the critical standard operating procedures, their relationships, and what they do to make the organization run. The third key is to develop your talent and evaluation methods. So when we talk about succession planning, this means we're having a person move on, no longer exist in their role, and we need to replace that role. We need to put a new person in that role. So having talent and evaluation methods is going to be very key to maintaining that smooth transition and ensure continuity of quality in what we do. So you need to develop an objective and thorough set of evaluation tools and processes to assess potential successors. And that might be internally, it could be external candidates as well. And so you want to look at how do we run a very transparent and open communications around our interview process. How do we eliminate biases and interview everyone the same way? So you want to also understand that when you bring a new person into a role, it's very critical, the attitudinal aspects of that person. So Carnegie Institute did a study, and they have something called the Carnegie Triangle, which essentially states that there are three key pillars to a successful person or role, and they are skills and knowledge, which pretty much everyone understands. And the third is attitude. But the surprising thing is that attitude is actually a full 85% of what it takes to be successful. So if you think, and you can do this quick mental exercise, but if you think about someone very successful, someone who really was at the pinnacle of their capabilities in a role, it could be a sports figure, a CEO who really achieved great success, and you start listing out what are the attributes of this person, determined, confident, you start to list this out, you'll see that most of these attributes are attitudinal. They're not skills and knowledge. And with the right attitude, you can acquire skills and knowledge. And I also like to include aptitude there as well, because I do believe that attitude and aptitude are very much interlinked. So I really encourage, as you look forward to doing interviews and evaluation and creating your own talent and evaluation methods, that you focus on attitude and aptitude mainly, because that's 85% of your success measure, and knowledge and skills really only amount to the remaining 15%. They can be important, but getting the right attitude and aptitude is by far way more important. So just to recap there, the three key principles for succession planning are creating a culture of adaptability, high degree of high quality communication, and transparency. Setting up that culture of adaptability will give you that pillar so that you are ready to deal with change, certainly in succession planning, but really any change. And that will actually make your organization much stronger. The second key is that knowledge transfer, making sure we've documented and codified our institutional knowledge into things that transcend the person. We can't just have all the information in somebody's head. We need it documented. We need to have training in place so that new people can come into roles very smoothly and minimize the disruption there. So that's a second key there. And then the third is creating evaluation methods and tools for talent when you need to fill into roles and replace someone who's moved on in succession, that you do that in a way that focuses primarily on attitude and aptitude, and that you establish methods that are very repeatable so that you're interviewing everyone in a uniform, data-based, unbiased fashion. Okay, so moving into the next section now, we're going to dive into a lot of details here. So what I'll do first is I'm going to run through the process that I see for succession planning, and then I'll bring up an Excel file and we'll look at the toolkit that I've put together that hopefully you now have downloaded for yourself and have that. So, talking about the process for succession planning, there's several keys here. First is that we identify the key positions, functions, and job roles. And you'll see that this process is built upon those three keys or three pillars I've discussed already. So we want to make sure that we understand all of the key positions and that we have in the organization. And if they're not individuals serving those, what are all the functions or job roles that we do have? You might even be a single person nonprofit organization. You still need to document what are all the functions that you do. And you should have those broken down. Again, I highly recommend reading the E-Myth Revisited if you haven't. But in that book, he talks about an organization just being run by two people, and then they start to define their roles, and it brings tremendous amount of clarity. And it'll be very difficult to do any type of succession planning if you don't define all of the functions and roles, whether they're held by different people or not. It is sort of secondary. So, do we have board members? Do we have executives? Right. And then once you've got all your job roles defined, determine which ones require attention. And I've got some toolkit here that will break down all the roles, and there's a starter there for you. But you need to understand, which one of these might be the most likely to need a succession plan and prioritize them based on that as well. So, and this will help to prioritize based on significance and impact, as well as likelihood that someone might move on. So the next step is to define the leadership qualities that you need, right? Determine the skills, experience, and attitude that is needed for the director and any other leadership roles. This is going to help you be able to identify not only potential candidates, but what are the attributes of those candidates we need to lead the organization effectively. Next, we should determine whether we will focus on internal or external succession. And so this process I'm talking about really comes into play once we're into, and it overlaps both preparing for succession and once we're in the midst of doing succession. And you'll see some of that in the plans that I've got laid out in the toolkit. But we want to find out, do we promote from within? Benefits there is that people are already familiar with the culture, the mission, and our operations. Or do we go for external candidates who might bring fresh perspectives and experience? Or maybe there's a mix of both. Or maybe we look at both and then decide from there. But that's an important decision that you want to have understood and documented as part of your succession plan. The next is you want to make sure that you start to develop a leadership pipeline in the organization. Make sure you establish a leadership development program and you're identifying high potential individuals and start to look for opportunities to mentor them. Maybe perhaps assign them with documenting the standard operating procedures, et cetera, so that you can assess their aptitude for that role, but also get that job done. So you want to make sure that in your organization, you're cultivating this pool of potential successors. And this will not only serve you in preparing for succession, but it will also serve you in your ongoing operations of creating sort of that franchise model. How do we get things, systems in place that allow our organization to run more effectively and efficiently? Then you want to create a succession planning timeline. And I have two examples of this in the kit, but make sure you understand what is the timeline that makes sense for us for leadership or the executive director's succession. This should allow for a smooth transition and allocate enough time to do that knowledge transfer. And again, I'm proposing here and strongly suggesting that you have all your documentation about standard operating procedures and all the knowledge transfer built long before you need to use it, but make sure that in the process of succession, you're allowing enough time to do that knowledge transfer. And so again, with the knowledge transfer process, make sure we have documentation of what is our vision for the organization. What are the values that are most important to us, our mission, and our goals and plans for the next quarter, 6 months, a year, 18 months, whatever makes the most sense for your organization. But try to think out into the future so that you have that. Make sure you have all your standard operating procedures documented. That's everything you do daily, day to day to run the organization. And the roles, responsibilities, relationships, and job duties across the organization. Just make sure all of that is clearly documented. And then you can utilize the formal mentorship programs or shadowing or even training to empower those successors once they come in. If you have a board, you want to engage them, involve them in the process, ensure they understand the importance of this and why we're doing it. Get their input because they may have very viable input. And if you do have a board and your executive director does leave, especially if it's somewhat unplanned or it happens urgently or in a surprise, then maybe the board can step in temporarily while you create you implement the more permanent successor. And just make sure that the board is giving you their support and their approval as well. You also want to make sure you have a good framework for succession. And this, again, we'll see this in the toolkit, but make sure that you create a framework that allows you to, in the case of when you need succession, you can plug in this framework and just use it. This will be clear policies and procedures for how we handle succession, document in any governance documents, in terms of decision making, escalation, what role the board plays if you have one, and just create that structured framework based on these recommendations I'm sharing here that will ensure future transitions and are smooth and consistency in the organization. And I hope that the toolkit I provided here will give you a really good start on that framework. Then again, another part of the process is the evaluation of candidates. This was my third pillar in the 3 keys. You want to make sure that you have that evaluation process. Again, consider attitude first, the Carnegie Triangle, then look at skills and experience. And make sure that, again, in this attitude evaluation, that you're aligning their values, their goals and mission with that of the organization. And make sure there's a strong alignment there. And obviously make sure that they can be an effective leader and inspire the organization in at least the same or maybe even possibly better ways than the prior leadership can. Again, communication and transparency, very important. This is one of the keys. Communicate with the stakeholders, certainly the key stakeholders like, throughout the organization at all levels, staff, volunteers, donors, and partners, not just leaders. You may have different levels of communication. The leadership team and the key staff may be involved in the process and decision making. Once those decisions are made, though, make sure they're communicated throughout the organization. And this includes external to the organization as well, such as donors and partners. And be very transparent. Show the process, the timeline, the reasoning behind things. You want to make sure that you create confidence when you have the need for succession, so that you don't have any issue with donors, or you're not creating any kind of uncertainty around the future viability of the mission. And then make sure that you allocate enough time for post-transition support. Hopefully you're doing succession in an expected and planned way, but even in emergency succession scenarios, you want to make sure that you try and provide as much support, ongoing support and guidance. Now, that can come from the person who's leaving the role, making sure you plan for enough time for them to stay on and help out. During that post period, providing the support, continuing their mentorship and coaching, or even regular check-ins. In the case of emergency succession, that may not be possible, so you want to make sure you have some other support, whether it be from the board or a group of a team or group of other leaders in the organization, or even outside help, such as like a business coach, like myself, even. And then measure the effectiveness of the successor in the role. We want to make sure that hopefully we've done succession planning well, that we've put exactly the perfect person in the role. But let's make sure we measure that. Let's not just assume that we've done it perfectly, but measure how successfully they are, and maybe be willing to add more coaching or make adjustments if that person is not successful. We don't want to sacrifice the mission of the entire organization if we perhaps don't have the right person in the role. And then make sure you create a plan to end the support smoothly and when appropriate. You might even ramp that support down over time, and kind of wean off of it as makes sense. So I have put together this succession planning workbook. So what I'd like to do with the rest of the time here is to walk through that with you. Hopefully you've got the toolkit, and you can make it your own. You definitely need to make it your own. This is just a template I've provided. But I hope it's a really good start that you can build from, and it will be available for download where you found this information, where you found this video in your organization, or at my website. I'll also make it available there, either at topdownstrategies.com or Mike Martin at focalpointcoaching.com, Michael Martin at focalpointcoaching.com. And I'll put those links up again.